Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar on the evolution of records and information management and the role or impact of digital transformation on that. We've still got a number of people rolling in, but I think we will kick off. So what we'll be covering today in the session will be the role of digital transformation, or what is digital transformation, give a very quick overview of the National Archives Digital Continuity 2020 policy. We'll look at environmentally at what has changed over the last 10 years in, I guess, the world around us. Look at the RIM approach and how that applies to that environment, and then have a quick chat around technology, integration, and migration. A bit of background and I guess the lens for today's session. Let's sort of begin with who I am. I'm Darren, I'm the CEO here at McTish, and probably surprising to most people is I am somewhat of a records and information management newcomer, only having been in this space for a little under 3 years. To further puzzle people, I'm not ICT qualified either. So I guess that generally poses the question of, so why on earth am I presenting this webinar? I'm bringing a slightly different perspective to today. I've got sort of 20 years experience in leading customer focused and technology based businesses. Each of these businesses have been on a journey of rapid growth, which has meant in turn enormous amount of change and change management. So usually I'm on the customer end of the records and information management space. Today I'm going to focus on bringing a high level, non-technical view of the RIM landscape based on the countless conversations I've had over the last 3 years with both RIM professionals and senior executives. I also want to highlight that today we're going to focus on unstructured content. When we start talking digital transformation, it's a pretty wide remit if you start looking at structured and unstructured content. So for the purposes of today, we'll try and stay focused on unstructured content. I'd also like to cover the fact that not all things will be equal. There's a number of different attendees on today's webinar from a variety of different businesses, being government agencies and different jurisdictions. So there are going to be nuances to the different environments that we work in. However, I think the underlying principles will be very similar and consistent. So for those that don't know much about McTish, I'll give a very brief overview of that. McTish has been around in the records and information management space for a little over 10 years now. Predominantly, or for the majority of that time, about 8 years of it, it was purely focused on TRIM, or we can call it content manager or records manager, but for the purposes of today, let's just call it TRIM. Over the last couple of years, we've been going through on a bit of a journey of evolution of our own, and that was about 2.5 years ago, actually. We took a step back and had a look at the records and information management landscape and tried to identify the challenges that were occurring for our clients, the engagement around end users, and come up with a design that worked in the current modern workplace. That led us to introducing a number of different vendors onto our books and having very much a best of breed focus, where we could not only focus on the eDRMS component of records and information management, but start to look at information architecture, the design of information, and really start to help clients generate and develop solutions that were specific to the way in which they wanted their new modern workplaces to actually function. That being said, as we go through today's webinar, if you do have any questions, please send them through on the chat. If my presenting skills allow, I'll try and answer those during the session. Failing that, I will definitely reach out to you post the session to continue any discussion that you'd like to have. So What is digital transformation? For us to address today's topic, I feel it's important that we first look at what digital transformation is. Digital transformation is an extremely broad term with a variety of definitions. It's commonly interchanged or confused with digitization and digitalization. I certainly know for me coming into this space and being in executive roles in other organizations prior to this, those terminologies or those terms often get interchanged and create some confusion with the actual focus. So digitization, definition of digitization according to Gartner's IT glossary is the process of changing analog to digital. Primarily this would be paper in our world, removing paper from our businesses and ensuring that the information that we have can be read by computer. Fairly simplistic, fairly consistent term, not often, I guess there's not many different variants around. Most people are pretty well aligned on what digitization is. That then moves us on to digitalization. Unlike digitization, there really is no single clear definition. So for the purposes of this, I'm just going to stick to Gartner's version for the conversation, and that is the use of digital technologies to change a business model and provide new revenue, value-producing opportunities. It is a process of moving to a digital business. So a lot broader in terms of its term, because we're starting to look at the ways in which we actually operate the business under a digital model, and it clearly identifies the way in finding new ways to operate the business and find new value producing opportunities. Interestingly, when I discuss this particular definition with people, when they hear the word value producing opportunities, they tend to think around new opportunities or new elements to the business. I often like to highlight to people having more information or having better understanding of your information or turning your information into knowledge is also a value producing opportunity. So just the creating of a process itself, or being able to track not only the information but the process, and having some process governance can also drive value producing opportunity for the business. I'm then going to start to talk a little bit more broader, and let's start to focus on digital business transformation. So it's the process of exploiting digital technologies and supporting capabilities to create a robust new digital business model, again derived from Gartner. I'll also talk about digital transformation. These two terms are highly interchangeable. I just use the basic Wikipedia definition for this one, which is the novel use of digital technology to solve traditional problems. These digital solutions enable new types of innovation and creativity rather than simply enhance or support traditional methods. From my perspective, digital transformation is strategic and is the overall impact to both the operations of a business and the culture of a business as a result of a series of digitalization projects. Digital transformation really needs to be owned and driven from a senior leadership level, be that CEO, board, executive committee, etc. All business strategies in today's day and age will have deeply embedded in it a digital transformation strategy. My observation is that in talking to senior executives around their strategies, some of those digital transformation strategies are not called out as an individual strategy, but if you go through the broader view and objectives of the business, you'll identify a number of digitalization projects or strategies within. Digital transformation is far-reaching and can encapsulate a plethora of different technologies, be that custom line of business systems, ERPs, CRM, cloud, big data, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, the list goes on. The vast majority of projects that we see, though, in the records and information management arena are really digitalization projects relating to unstructured content, and more often centered around business collaboration and productivity tools like Office 365, traditional content repositories like network file shares, and traditional eDRMS systems. The fast-moving component of what we see in the digitalization or digital transformation space has been business process automation. And this has predominantly been driven by workflow tools like the workflow within Trim, Microsoft Flow, or the likes of Nintex. Hopefully that gives a bit of a summary of what we're talking when we talk about digital transformation and, more importantly, digitalization projects, and gives a bit of a view for today. I just quickly want to talk about the Digital Continuity 2020 policy from National Archives. At its highest level, there are three core principles to the digital continuity policy. I'm going to go through them, and I've just highlighted the key words in there that sometimes I feel get missed when people are reading through the principles. Number one, information is to be valued. Agencies' heads are accountable for information governance in their agency. Information is created, stored, used, and managed effectively and accountably, destroyed if it is no longer required. Agencies have appropriately skilled and qualified staff responsible for information management. Well, I think the third bullet point is generally music to the ears of everyone in our industry. But I just want to talk about information governance. It's an area, if I look at the digital continuity policy and the conversations we have with virtually all of our organizations and clients, is information governance is generally lacking. And really needs to be a focus of every organization, and needs to be an ongoing piece of work, not an individual project that just gets, I guess, actioned and completed. It really needs to live and breathe with the organization. The second word that I've highlighted there is effectively. I'm going to table a couple of concepts and thoughts today around the volume of information and effectively managing it, rather than trying to manage the information within an inch of its life. So I just wanted to call that word out very quickly. Second principle is information is managed digitally. I won't read through the bullet points, but bullet point one does say entirely digital workplace. That means the eradication of all paper. The observations we see is there's a lot of organizations that are a long way off in going entirely digital. And generally that's because from a records and information management perspective and interaction with the business itself, we don't understand all of their business processes. And with the size of some of the organizations we deal with, it can be a mammoth task to try and understand all of their work processes. It also says that where there are benefits for an agency, information in analog formats, let's just call that paper again for the sake of it, is migrated to a digital format. We'll talk about this specifically a little bit later on. And information is interoperable. I'm just going to highlight the key piece that we think is central to the RIM approach these days, and that is it remains findable, shareable, and reusable. And that theme will come up as we move through this presentation. What I want to do now is back in February, National Archives released their update report on the progress that was being made towards Digital Continuity 2020 by all of the agencies. The Checkup Plus report that was released gave all the agencies an overall rating of 3.1 out of 5 for their progress towards implementation of digital continuity. I just wanted to call out what we see as some of the really, I guess, concerning or areas of demand that are going to be required for all of us to be able to effectively deliver this digital continuity policy. 36% of agencies didn't have an information management and governance strategy, and a further 36 had one but cited that it was out of date or needed to be updated. This is just, from our perspective, a consequence of change in speed of business. The businesses, the systems, the implementations of systems have all moved at a pace that has made it hard for RIM professionals to keep up. Only 35% of agencies had an enterprise-wide information architecture in place. We'll touch on that a little bit later. 75% of agencies rarely or never used analytics to identify how information is being used and how long it needs to be kept. That was quite alarming from our perspective. We anticipated that number to be a lot lower. We see with a lot of our interactions with senior executives, and certainly when I'm talking to senior executives around records and information management projects that they're looking to undertake, the ability for those senior executives to have and digest data and analytics on where organizations are currently at, but more importantly, where they're going to be, is paramount, is generally a key decision point for a lot of those senior executives. In a lot of the other business areas that they operate, you know, if I use an example of, you know, a customer service team or client interactions, we're now used to, as a senior management group, to having a plethora of information at our disposal to make decisions on. That should be no different for RIM, and really should be a focus of us as a collective industry. 77% of agencies, most of the time or almost always, kept information in an uncontrolled environment. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. I've got some theories on where I think a lot of that percentage comes from and how you might be able to quickly and easily address that within your own organization. Only 13% automate the discovery and removal of duplicate, redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. Again, we'll touch on that later. 43% rarely or sometimes convert and migrate information and its metadata to ensure it remains reusable. Probably one of the key things in here is legacy technology and how you retire legacy technology. That has typically been the remit of ICT and generally remains the remit of ICT. However, what often isn't thought of as they retire those legacy systems is how we access or maintain that data so it is reusable in the future. And 40% rarely or sometimes use digital repositories have appropriate functionality, preserve information according to its value. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit around Office 365 and some of its configuration points. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but that is one of the areas where I think working on the configuration of existing systems can substantially improve the management of content within our organizations. Let's just do a quick 10-year environmental change. To be serious with everyone, this part of the discussion could have been endless. When you start to take a close look at the developments that have occurred in business and information and the volume of information over the last 10 years, it is seriously mind-blowing and continues to move at a rate of knots. When thinking about our environment and the management of unstructured information, again, going back to the lens for today being unstructured information and records, I've tried to narrow focus to two areas, and that is the way we work and then the technology. First of all, in technology, the proliferation of systems. We've seen an unprecedented number of systems come online in the last 10 years. And more specifically, we see a lot more niche systems. We have a particular business unit or department wanting to access or deploy a piece of software that is specific to their purposes. It is often the bane of existence of a lot of IT teams. And to further exacerbate that, you've got what we call the credit card technology systems as well, where they're a short, simple, cost-effective monthly subscription, which for a lot of IT teams can be hard to control. From a RIM perspective, that just means splintering of information for us, so making it harder for us to control the information the organization creates and interacts with. Speed of enhancements. Over 400 releases just in Office 365 last year. Not to mention the complexity of these systems. As consumers of IT systems, we demand more and more functionality on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. The cycle times for product releases have increased dramatically. And there's always a level of ambiguity now from an IT perspective, where we used to get IT systems, and think about the old days of Windows. They used to get released on a disk. We take them through a series of testing and then deploy it. That is fast evaporating nowadays with the volume of releases and the move to SaaS. The exposure of information and data, this is probably one I don't need to explain to anyone that's on this call, but if I look at data that comes out of, say, IDC, where 80% of the world's data is planned to be unstructured by the year 2020. We only need to think about our day-to-day lives and the information that is now captured. The question is, how much of it is useful, especially in the business context? Email is still a core component of this data explosion. Despite the advent of chat and Slack and all of the other technologies that we communicate and collaborate on, the global number of emails sent and received per year will surpass 293 billion in the year 2019. The mind-blowing part of that stat is that's 293 billion per day. To further emphasize email, 62% of business people still say that they prefer to communicate via email for business purposes. Email is the primary source and continues to be the primary source of information duplication, and is usually the king of rot when we start to talk about redundant, obsolete, trivial. Having a clear email management plan in place is critical from our perspective. Cloud, well, if I use a dad joke, clouds have been around for millions of years, but it now seems that the cloud solves all IT problems. More specifically or relevant to this evolution from my perspective is SaaS. We can talk about cloud in terms of taking on-premise deployments of software and putting them into a data center as cloud. I don't think that's really the core change for us in a room space. It's more specifically that evolution of software as a service. And the transient nature of some of these applications, especially the ones that store unstructured content. Further to that, wide flat structures have become the norm rather than deep hierarchical constructs for information. This is really driven from the number of systems that we have, number one, but also the amount of collaboration and the way in which we want to manage and use and share the information. Moving over to the way we work now. Collaboration, if I had $1 for every time I hear this word, I'm going to go back to what we were saying before about the explosion of information and data and what we have. The core question for me is, do we really need to capture it all? If I look at collaboration in terms of Microsoft Teams, Slack, SharePoint, Box, there's a long list of collaboration software and tools. The core question I continue to ask is, do we really need to capture it? And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Sharing, and I've put in brackets by default. We just love to share, whether it's a picture of the food that we're eating on Facebook, whether it's a selfie of where somewhere we're sitting, or even in business. Traditionally that was via email with the old CC and blind CC. Sharing is just growing at an exponential rate. Even the way in which we conduct business, has now the view with the amount of information available is you need to share. You need to share your approach. You need to share the way you do things. And historically, I look at some of the sharing that occurs now, even within our space. Some of those things would have been considered or seen as trade secrets, but the way in which we've evolved and the way in which we work is we now share by default. Because as consumers, we want to take in that information. that makes a massive difference to the way in which we design and architect, our room controls and our room systems when we have sharing as the default. The impact is also, if we're sharing, we should be breaking down silos of information as well. So in turn, that can be advantageous for us in the room space. Access to information. With more data came more insights, and with more insights came the reliance, sort of just the ability to share and access information and data. And off the back of that, analytics and database decisions. I mentioned a little bit before when we were talking about the National Archive stats. Analytics and database decision is key. I can recall a number of conversations where if I was talking to a senior executive in traditional terms like taxonomy and metadata, that they literally just glaze over. The minute we put a dashboard in front of them highlighting information, how that's being used, the level of engagement dramatically increases. The reality is now we know the data is available. We want to make decisions based off that data and make informed decisions, no matter what that may be in business. This one is huge and will continue to evolve, and that is work is not an activity, is an activity, not a destination. More and more of the workforce work in disparate locations and across a wider cross-section of the hours in the day. This has got to be considered, and it has a massive impact when we're thinking about how we manage and work with information. And the last one, which could have lived in technology, but I threw it in the way we work, which is small screens and big screens. With working remotely and more flexibly and in a mobile fashion, the evolution of screen real estate's come about. At one moment, we can be happy using a 7-inch screen on our mobile phone while we're walking down the street, and in the next minute, 2 24-inch monitors on our desk just doesn't feel like enough. This all has an impact on how we need to handle and manage information and how and when we like to do it. This is a challenge when we start to think about the user interface and the design of some of our records and information management systems. Because for an end user now, how they want to use the system can change based on where they are and what they're doing and which device they're on. Let's start to dig down in the change of approach. I'm going to go back and recap and say, a lot of this conversation today, or a lot of this change of approach is what we've observed, what we've seen, and I guess what we've implemented when working with clients to create a better modern workplace solution. It's a really broad topic, so I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone as we go. But here are some of the key things that we believe are key in the change to approach. This is one that I keep saying over and over again. I probably coined it about a year ago, and that is eDRM is not the center of the universe, and probably never was. Interestingly, when I came into this space and started to talk to room practitioners around their eDRMS, they talked to me like it was the center of the universe, like everything had to be put inside that eDRMS. And in looking at a number of those eDRMS implementations, they were challenged, and they were challenged by not in relation to the design and the configuration and the skills of the room team, but they were challenged predominantly by end user engagement. The end users just want to use the systems that are in to get their job done. They don't really want to care or think about records and information management. This is really core to the approach that we have right now. eDRMS is important. Having control of your information and records is super important. We just need to make sure that it is our focus. We're not forcing that focus on the rest of the business. We'll talk about that in a sec. Start with your high value information. We talked before around the explosion of data and information. Trying to capture and manage all records or all information that you believe is a record is often a challenge that can't be overcome, just due to the growth of unstructured content. Now, our advice always is to focus on your high value information or records. The way I talked about it with clients is, You know, if I think of it like flying in a plane, you've got your first class content, your business class content, and then your economy content. You know, bulk of the information or bulk of the content, let's say 70 or 80% of it, is going to be sitting in economy. The special service and attention that you give from a RIM perspective should be focused on your business and your first class information. You know, I'm going to keep talking about that high value information for a second. Chat is one that often comes up, and we see organizations focused on trying to capture decisions that are made in chat. And the scenario that I often put to people is typically that decision may or could or would have been made over a conversation, walking through the hallway, making a coffee in the tea room, and we never would have captured it. So just because it is now available, does that mean that we actually need to capture it? Or are there other business processes in place that adequately capture the outcome anyway? Know where your information lives and manage it in place. Again, we don't see eDRMS as the center of the universe. We believe the focus should be managing your information in place. That really starts with having a clear information asset register. One system is rarely a reality, even for unstructured content these days. And even if I look at the organizations that are, say, moving to Office 365, where the vast majority of their content, unstructured content, would be captured within Office 365, you've then got other considerations within that. You know, are they using OneDrive, SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams, Yammer, a combination of which? You know, the key is you want to leave content where it is, and where appropriate, try and federate that content back into your records management system. Structure the unstructured. Pretty simple from our perspective. You really need to maintain a clear information architecture. You know, as I came into this space, SharePoint was often, you know, a dirty word. And really, there was nothing wrong with SharePoint itself. It was really the understanding of the users and the way in which the information is architected within SharePoint. You know, bringing structure to the content is key. The difference nowadays with the likes of SharePoint, SharePoint Online, Box, a number of other systems is this is not two-dimensional or a hierarchical structure. You need to create, capture, and harness the power of metadata to give multiple views of the content. As I mentioned before, we're not hamstrung now by displaying information in one way all the time to our client base, and the way in which end users wish to interact with that information will change based on the device they're using and what they're particularly doing. You know, smart information architecture can drive a good chunk of the metadata that's required to provide these views. The other part requires end users. And we talked before about end users potentially not engaging the way we would like around our eDRMS implementations. So what's going to change in today's day and age? Well, the key from our perspective is you want to be capturing the metadata that drives value and insights for them. Typically, that will be directly aligned to what we require to be able to understand the value and assign retention and disposal to a lot of that information. So if you're capturing the information that they understand and that they know firsthand, and generally the example I give is, you know, if someone in procurement is saving a contract and asks them what the term of that contract is, what the value of that contract is, they would be happy to give that to you. And that's really meaningful information from a records and information management perspective, and also information that can drive some really good analytics for the business in terms of what they're doing. You know, the IDC data research shows that, you know, the average employee spends 19.8% of their time searching for information. So we're talking, that's a day a week or 2 hours a day. I certainly know from my perspective, I've seen that in a lot of organizations. We really need to make sure that we educate the end users that metadata is about making information findable. findable and reusable, aligned back to what National Archives policy is. Transparent records management, preferably rules-based. Whether we like it or not, end users just don't tend to engage with records management, and from a senior executive perspective, nor should they. We really need to, by design, have transparent records management where we're capturing things that are of value to the business and then using that to enact or to action our records management policies and requirements. I've put in there preferably rules-based because, you know, with a number of the systems nowadays and the metadata that you can create and have available, you can automatically start to not only classify but also attach retention and disposal to this information, allowing us to be less reactive and more proactive to the requirements of information management. Take a big bucket approach. Again, with the volume of information that is out there, I don't believe you can manage your information to within an inch of its life. Typically, when we're working with a client, we're looking at the retention and disposal schedules they're having, and we're working out what the most appropriate way is to roll up those retention and disposal schedules in a way that works with the business, mitigates risk without over managing the information. You know, one of the interesting things that I saw when coming into this industry was all of these beautifully architected and designed eDRM systems with fantastic retention and disposal schedules. And then I would often ask clients, A, who's using them? And they would say maybe 10% of the content, 20% of the content gets into the systems. And secondly, when was the last time you did a disposal? And often the answer to that was never, or a very long time ago. It makes no sense to overcomplicate the management of records, which is why we tend to focus on a big bucket approach. Again, focused on the information of value, thinking in that first class, business class mentality around the information. And lastly, focus on discovery, not finding and filing and disposal. I can tell a story recently of a federal client that we were dealing with in Canberra, and their senior executive took exception to the fact that we were trying to do a records and information management process, had zero interest in trying to change the way in which people worked to manage information and records and what they saw as risk. As soon as we started to talk taxonomy, etc., just totally lost interest. We reframed that exact conversation in the next meeting, working with their RIM team around focusing on the efficiencies, the information and intelligence we could drive from the information. And we got a unanimous, you know, hands up, let's move forward with this project. It's really important that you focus on the discovery of the information and how it drives the productivity of the business. The filing and disposal and more so disposal is still extremely important, but it's a function that we can handle within the expertise of RIM, not troubling the rest of the business about it. Let's move on to technology and talk a little bit about technological approach. There's a whole raft of different systems and new systems that are available to help in the way in which we manage information and records nowadays. I'm just going to talk at a fairly high level around some of the key things that we like our clients to keep in the front of their mind. Open APIs. Majority of systems now have open APIs. You need to look to leverage these to federate content wherever you can, and again, keep the focus on high value content, not the total sum of the content. Avoid custom coding and integrations at all costs. You know, as I said before, the pace of change for the technology nowadays it just makes custom coding and integrations really difficult. Integrations can still be a requirement for a lot of organizations. However, there are platforms to make that a lot easier, to save you having to have someone sitting there punching keys every time you want to try and make a change or update your records management system. migrations. I've put here from a RIM perspective, get involved. The reason I've said that is the vast majority of conversations we have with clients, I'm surprised the number of times that RIM haven't been involved in data migrations to the extent that they should have been. And it's generally a function that's managed by IT. The key things that surprise me when we go through it is cleanup. You know, there's generally not a cleanup of redundant, obsolete, trivial content. And it's generally just a lift and shift or a dump of information. A lot of the messaging I hear coming out of RIM is, you know, cost of storage. The reality is the cost of storage is negligible. IT just are not motivated by the cost of storage. So their desires to clean up content are pretty much falling on deaf ears if you're talking to them around the cost of content. You know, the key driver from my perspective is discovery and talking to them about moving. You know, a lot of the cases that we see at the moment are organizations moving from network file shares into the likes of Office 365 / SharePoint Online, or moving from SharePoint On-Prem to SharePoint Online. And really what we talk to clients about is your ability or the need to clean up redundant, obsolete, trivial data. And more importantly, use the migration as the opportunity to discover and enhance the content before you migrate it. You know, we use examples like, if you could give us a list of project numbers, you know, the ability to read every document, understand which documents apply to which projects, and then attaching that as a piece of metadata before you migrate it into your system gives you a plethora of information. You know, we've got examples of migrations where RIM teams have focused on understanding what content they're looking for, using simplistic terms like employee numbers or asset numbers or project numbers or clauses that live within legal contracts. And then as a result of that migration, we've been able to identify content, attach metadata, and then appropriately dispose of it before we got to the other end. You know, a lot of the organizations I talk to, network file shares specifically, are really like the Wild West. No one really knows what's in them. Generally, their structures and their file structures have changed over time. So even the end business units struggle to use or find the information in that time. This is a perfect opportunity when migrating to try and understand that information better and drive some insights from it. And it is not as difficult as most might think. However, I believe majority of IT teams are not motivated or willing to do that unless we can talk to them about how it enhances the end user experience on the other end. So if we adequately clean up and add metadata to this information, we say, as an example, put it then into SharePoint Online, and that drives a much better search experience for the end user, makes it easier for them to find things and do their day-to-day job, remembering that, you know, 2 hours a day or 1 day a week gets lost looking for information. Then that is a great outcome for IT, because at the end of the day, then users go, wow, you've rolled out this SharePoint Online thing, and it is brilliant. I can find all my information. Governance and security is now going to transcend multiple systems. You know, I often talk about the configuration of Office 365 because the vast majority of our clients are on or moving to that platform. There is a whole raft of configuration and security and governance built into a lot of the systems that we use, but sometimes as RIM professionals, we're just not across them. So I often encourage RIM professionals within organizations to understand all of the tools that might currently be at disposal, including investigating how to configure existing systems you may have, and using them, especially to manage that economy class. You know, you just don't need the level of functionality we typically have within an eDRMS system if you're just trying to manage low value information within a system. But nowadays, it is really a governance and security model that transcends all of the systems that you're going to be using storing content in. Consider the impact of mobile devices. You You know, I was talking to a client the other day around the structure of their SharePoint online. They're in the process of moving to Office 365, and traditionally they've had a very hierarchical approach to how they've filed and classified and maintained information. And some of their business units were on board with that. Others were neither here nor there. And the lens I asked those guys to think about is, whilst that structure may have worked for those end users, whilst they're sitting at their desk with, you know, a couple of 24-inch monitors and another screen sitting in front of them, how well does that work, and how well does that navigation and the way that information is structured work when you're sitting on an iPad, when you're moving from client to client, when you're out in the field? Again, the impact of mobile technology and the way in which we work has a really distinct imprint on the way in which we manage and structure the information and the configuration of the systems. And again, without harping on it, is why metadata and capturing metadata and providing multiple views to customers is just critical in today's day and age. Scan to remove new, physical, and scan old physical when required. It is very, very rare that we see a back scanning project deliver any sort of ROI, unless the business has a specific agenda to do that. Sometimes senior execs have a specific agenda to remove all of the paper that is historic, but in terms of business process and efficiency, we very, very rarely see an ROI in back scanning projects. We tend to turn around and say, scan on demand and really focus on your high value information. You may want to back scan some high value records. Again, we were dealing with a client out of education not so long ago, and we obviously went back and scanned all of their teacher records as an example, because it's something that is critical to the way in which they operate. Very, very quickly, you're going to touch on buy-in and change management. Change management is a topic of its own, and we could spend another 4 hours on it. But the overarching thing that I've seen in my last 3 years that I want to get across to, I'm just going to say RIM professionals in general. I know not everyone does it this way, but just do not lead with compliance. Please do not lead with compliance. Try to use growth terms when trying to engage executives in the business, whether that be efficiency, customer experience, mobility, discovery. You know, find those terms that are related to your own organization strategy and the approach you want to take. Compliance is just not going to get engagement. You know, yes, there's risk. Yes, we know that there are you know, policies and there's requirements for us to maintain information, records and information in a certain way. I think if we're all honest, a lot of organizations don't do that. The National Archives survey showing that we're not doing it the way that we should do it. So by banging the same drum, we are not going to get a different result. Please focus on the positive growth terms. And when talking to the businesses, use terminology that relates to the audience and the outcomes that motivate them. You know, again, if I'm talking to senior management, we're generally talking about efficiency, analytics, ability to make decisions. If we're talking to end users, we're talking about transparency and easy to find and discover things, easy to share information. It's really got to be focused on what is in it for them. I know you've heard that 1,000 times, but the number of presentations and business cases we see from RIM professionals that are looking at the situation from a RIM lens is mind-blowing. It is really got to be about the end users and giving leadership something that they can hang their hat on. And just generally, the vast majority of projects that we see and enact and work with clients on are pilot. They're not big bang. We move through methodically, department by department, and whilst we may start with an information architecture that is enterprise-wide, it doesn't just stop there. We continue to refine that as we go through, because the reality is, as you work with each business unit, you will learn more about the way in which they operate and the information that they have. You know, typically the retention and disposal schedule will highlight, you know, use the old 80% rule, 80% of the high value and important information that we need to capture. But there will be some outliers that we will only identify once we start to work with departments. So we prefer that you use a pilot approach and an iterative approach where you go back and continue to improve and refine the information. Again, if you're using a transparent records management approach where you're trying to use rules to handle your retention and disposal and leveraging metadata, from a RIM professional or a use of your time, we want to move that from being reactionary and disposal focused to proactive working with the business. Some takeaways from today for your consideration. Understand where the content lives and manage it in place. Make records management transparent to end users. Focus on your high value content. There is just far too much information and content these days to try and appropriately capture everything. And the reality is, if you make it hard for your end users, they'll find ways around it anyway. Look to take a big bucket approach, especially for that lower value content. Email is still the primary content and context repository for end users. Have a look at the email management systems that are around. Not only does it make it better from a RIM perspective, but it certainly makes life easier for your end users as well. Use metadata to drive business value and analytics. Look to understand and enhance information when migrating, and only integrate out of the box if you have to. We covered a lot of ground today. We've put forward a number of approaches that we think work. The devil is always in the detail, but I think to the testament of our team over the course of the last couple of years, we've delivered some very successful digital transformation projects for our clients, and really helped them change the way in which they work and driven a modern workplace based off a number of the things we talked to today, but primarily around making records management transparent, driving some good information for the business, and federating the content that they have. I didn't see any questions come through from today. Please reach out to any of our team if you do have any post the webinar, and I thank everyone for their attendance today. Have a good day.